People think anger keeps you strong, but most of the time it just keeps you busy. Busy blaming the wrong person while your real life slips quietly by. My name is Simon Fillmore, and I am 88 years old, and for most of my adult life I believed I knew exactly who had ruined my happiness. I was wrong, and it took me 30 years to understand that. I grew up believing that clarity was the same thing as truth. When something went wrong, I wanted a name for it, a face I could picture, someone I could point to in my mind and say, "This is where it broke." That habit followed me into adulthood, into marriage, into fatherhood, and into the long years that followed after everything fell apart. I was a hard-working man, not perfect, but dependable, and when my marriage ended in my late 40s, I decided the reason was simple. I blamed my wife. I told myself she didn't appreciate me, that she changed, that she turned cold and distant, that she poisoned our home with silence. I replayed moments again and again, her walking out of a room while I was talking, her tired eyes at the dinner table, the way she stopped laughing at my jokes. Each memory became evidence in a private courtroom where I was always innocent and she was always guilty. When the divorce papers were signed, I felt a strange sense of relief mixed with rage, like I had finally been proven right but still lost something precious. For years after, I carried that anger like a personal history lesson I taught myself every night. When friends asked why things ended, I told my version calmly, confidently, as if repetition made it more true. When my children visited, I was careful not to poison them against their mother. But the bitterness lived in my tone, in the way I sighed when her name came up, in the way I grew quiet. I believed I was being mature, but what I was really doing was preserving my resentment. Life moved on, as it does whether you're ready or not. I worked, I retired, I watched my children become adults with their own struggles, and I remained convinced that a single person had derailed the life I was meant to have. Anger became familiar, almost comfortable. It gave me a story that explained everything without asking me to look too closely at myself. The first crack in that story didn't come from a dramatic moment. It came from a visit. One afternoon, nearly 30 years after the divorce, my daughter stopped by unexpectedly. We sat in the living room, the same one she used to play in as a child, and we talked about ordinary things. Then she mentioned her mother had been ill for a while. Not dangerously, but enough to slow her down. She said it gently, not accusing, just factual. Something in me shifted, not guilt, not fear, but confusion. I realized I had never once asked how her mother was doing. Not really. That night I couldn't sleep. Not because of worry, but because a question kept repeating in my mind, one I had avoided for decades. What if my story was incomplete? Not wrong in every detail, but missing something essential. I thought back to those years before the marriage collapsed. Not just what she did, but what I did not do. The long hours at work I called responsibility. The conversations I postponed because I was tired. The way I listened to respond instead of to understand. I had always framed myself as the steady one, the provider, but I had never asked whether I was present. The realization didn't hit all at once. It arrived slowly, like light entering a room through a curtain you didn't know was open. I began to see how my wife's silence had not started as rejection, but as exhaustion. How her distance may have been a response, not an attack. I remembered moments I had dismissed, her trying to talk late at night when I wanted to sleep, her frustration when I brushed things off as small problems. At the time, I thought I was keeping peace, Now I saw I was avoiding discomfort. The most painful truth was this: I had been angry at her for leaving, but I had never forgiven myself for not noticing she was already gone long before she packed her bags. That anger was easier than regret. Blame was simpler than responsibility. As long as I believed she was the cause, I never had to ask whether I could have been different. A few weeks later, I did something I had never imagined I would do. I asked my daughter if she thought her mother would be open to a conversation. Not to reopen wounds or rewrite history, just to talk honestly, without accusation. When the day came, we sat across from each other like two old strangers who shared a language only time could teach. There were no raised voices, no dramatic confessions, just quiet truths. She told me how lonely she'd felt. I told her how afraid I had been of failing. We didn't fix the past, but we finally named it. What surprised me most was not her forgiveness, but my own. Not forgiveness toward her, but toward myself. I understood that I had done the best I could with the tools I had at the time, and that those tools were limited. I also understood that anger had kept me frozen, stuck in a version of myself that never learned anything new. Letting go didn't erase the pain, but it returned something far more valuable: time. Not more years, but more presence in the ones I had left. Now, at 88, I think about how many people are carrying anger like I did, convinced it is loyalty to their pain, when really it is a barrier to understanding. If you're listening to this and holding on to a story that keeps you comfortable but bitter, I won't tell you to let it go. I'll only suggest you look at it gently, from another angle, and ask what it protects you from seeing. I spent 30 years angry at the wrong person, and in doing so, I delayed my own peace. If my life has taught me anything worth passing on, it's this: clarity without compassion is not wisdom, and blame without reflection is just another way to stay lost. If you still have time, even a little, use it to understand, not to accuse. That choice can change everything, even at the very end.